Okay, so now let's talk about section 2.1. In section 2.1, it's called rectangular coordinates. And graphs. All right, so we have a couple of things to talk about in this section. They are distance and midpoint formula. So let's go over a little bit about where these come from. So let's say we had a point right here. We'll call it 2, 6. Let's say we had another point over here, maybe 8, 2. Well, if the distance formula didn't exist, how could we figure it out? That's the distance we want to find. And if you saw this before, we could actually make a right triangle and figure out the Pythagorean theorem. Now the Pythagorean theorem, I proved where that came from. There's a video if you'd like to see it. It's also in this playlist. So let's go ahead and figure this out. Pythagorean theorem, remember, would be a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, and c squared is our distance. So in order to figure out what a is, well, we're going from 2 to 8, right? So how long is that? 6. What you do is you take 8 and you subtract 2, and we're going to square that because that's a Pythagorean theorem. Now b, the y value here is 6, the y value here is 2. So how long is b? The answer is 4, because we subtracted those. But because I did 8 minus 2, I'm going to do 2 minus 6. It doesn't matter because we're squaring it anyway. And then c represents our distance, right? But I don't want to know what the distance squared is. I'd rather just get the distance by itself. And this is the distance formula. So the distance formula comes from the Pythagorean theorem. So what you need to know is that the distance formula is equal to, we'll call it x1 minus x2 squared plus y1 minus y2 squared, and the whole thing inside of a square root. Now some people say it's x2 minus x1. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. So let's go ahead and answer this question. 8 minus 2 is 6, so we're going to do 6 squared, plus this would be negative 4 squared. Well, 36 plus 16 is 52. Now we'll do our prime factorization. This is 2 and 26. 26 is 2 and 13. So it looks like we have a group of 2's right here. So our distance would equal 2 with root 13 left over. Whenever we're talking about distance, we always say units too. If you're driving down the shore, you don't tell me that it's 80 away. That doesn't make any sense. You would say it's 80 miles away. There's always should be a units on it. So that's our distance formula. Let's talk about midpoint. And we'll find the midpoint of those same 2 points. We had 2, 6. And we had 8, 2. Well, the midpoint would be like right here somewhere, right? So the midpoint, if you were to take the x values and find the average of them, that would give us a point like right here. Right? This would be the average of the x's. Right in the middle. If we were to take the y values of this point and this point, and find the average, put us like right here. This represents the average y value. And if you take a look, you see how the two of them cross right here? That's the midpoint. So the way that we find the midpoint is we take the average of the x values and we take the average of the y values. Remember, when we're finding the average, you add up the two values and you divide by the total number. You add up the two y values and you divide by the total number. That's how you find the midpoint. So let's go ahead and do that. 1 point was 2, 6. So I'm going to add up 2 and 8, divide by 2. And I'm going to add up the two y values, 6 plus 2, and divide by 2. So the midpoint for these 2 points, 10 divided by 2 is 5. 8 divided by 2 is 4. That would be the midpoint. Let's see how close I was. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so my lines weren't really that evenly spaced. That's pretty bad, but you get the idea. It's somewhere 5 and then 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4 was pretty good. The x is I mean, look at this. This distance is huge and this is small. So if I drew it a little bit more accurately, it would be making, it would be exactly on 5, 4. So to finish up this section, I want to find the distance and midpoint of 3 examples. And let's take a look. So we'll do 1, -3, and 2, -4. Okay. So I think what we'll do is maybe we'll try to get a little bit organized here. We'll do the distance there, and we'll do the midpoint a little bit further out. That's how we'll do it. So if we have x1, y1, x2, y2, let's go ahead and do it. Our distance would be x1 minus x2 squared plus y1 minus y2. And just be careful, because remember, you're subtracting a negative, right? So sometimes people get excited and they just put one of the negatives, but you're subtracting a negative, you have to put that. So our distance would be 1 minus 2 is -1 squared, plus -3 plus 4 is 1 squared. So our distance here would be 1 plus 1 is 2, or square root of 2 units. As far as our midpoint, we're going to add the coordinates, 1 plus 2, and then divide by the total number. We're going to add the y values and divide by the total number. So 3 halves and -7 halves would be our midpoint. Let's do a couple more. Everyone loves fractions, so let's do one like that. My high school kids, I bust their chops. I tell them that fractions is my middle name, so let's see here. Hope you guys are good with fractions. If not, we'll work on it together. Second point is 2/3 and -1/2. All right. So the distance would be equal to, we're going to have 1/2 minus 2/3, squared it, plus the y values, -1/3 minus -1/2, square it. When we have fractions, we need a common denominator. So 1/2 is the same thing as 3/6 minus 4/6, or -1/6 squared plus -1/3 is the same thing as -2/6 plus 3/6 is 1/6 squared. So our distance here would be 1/36 plus 1/36, which is the square root of 2/36, which is square root of 2 over 6 units. It's not that big of a deal. Midpoint, what this is going to be is we're going to have to add them up and divide by 2. So we're going to have 1/2 plus 2/3 divide by 2, and then negative 1/3 plus negative 1/2, divide that by 2. Well, to get a common denominator, 1/2 plus 2/3 would be 3/6 plus 4/6 is 7 over 6. And we're going to divide by 2 or multiply by 1/2. To get a common denominator with the y's, that's going to be negative 2/6 plus negative 3/6. And let's see what that is. It's negative 5/6. And we're going to be dividing by 2. Now remember, when we divide by 2, we talked about this. It's the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. And this would just be 7 over 12, comma, negative 5 over 12. So it takes a little bit of work, but it's not hard math. It's just more annoying than anything else. And one more problem here. Let's do some radicals. Say we had 2 root 3, comma, 4 root 2. And let's see here. We have 2 root 3, 4 root 2. And the second point is going to be 3 root 3 and 5 root 2. So I'm just going to do this here. Okay, so let's get our distance. The way we find our distance is we subtract them. So we're going to have 2 root 3 minus 3 root 3, and we'll square that, plus y values. 4 root 2 minus 5 root 2, and we'll square that. Take the whole square root. So this comes out to 2 root 3 minus 3 root 3 is negative 1 root 3. 4 root 2 minus 5 root 2 is negative 1 root 2. Now when you're squaring this, remember, anytime you're multiplying, you could distribute the power. So negative 1 squared is 1. Square root of 3 squared, or square root of 3 times square root of 3, is the square root of 9. Same thing here. Negative 1 squared is 1. The square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 4. So we get 3 plus 2 is 5. That would be our distance here. And let's find the midpoint. To get the midpoint, we're going to take 2 root 3 plus 3 root 3 and divide it by 2. It's going to be the x values, and the y values would be 4 root 2 plus 5 root 2, and we're going to divide the whole thing by 2. So let's see what this comes out to. We're going to have 5 root 3 divided by 2, and 9 root 2 divided by 2. So we don't have any radicals in the denominator, so we're done. That's it. Now you might also see an answer written like this: 5/2 root 3. It doesn't matter how you want to write it. Comma 9/2 root 2. I mean, they're both exactly the same thing. I think this one looks a little prettier. All right, stay tuned for the next lesson.